Celestial Nighthawk got a massive buff this season, and as you've probably seen with other content creators by now, it's part of one of the best solar hunter builds there's ever been in Destiny. Massive burst DPS for bosses, fast super regeneration, infinite radiant, and infinite restoration. All this allows you to absolutely dominate dungeons and raid encounters. But what I was surprised about this build is how well it performed in Legend and Master content in terms of dealing with champions. What I haven't seen other content creators talk about is the perfect pairing for this build in terms of your main workhorse weapon, which will make the build an absolute monster for even Grandmaster Nightfalls as well. You've probably seen this build paired with Sunshot, which is a great weapon in its own right, especially this season. You've probably already seen this build with Bad Juju, which allows for even faster super regeneration, but the one weapon pairing I've not seen many people talk about is Vex Mythoclast, which itself got a huge buff this season. Celestial Vex is an absolute monster pairing for any content out there. Before we get into why Vex specifically, let's dive into the Celestial Solar Hunter build itself. So Celestial Nighthawk in Season of the Wish got a massive buff and overall rework to its base functionality. Its impact damage was buffed by 25%, which means it hits for a whole lot harder this season than ever before. It instantly refunds 33% of your super energy on a golden gun kill now as well. And now wearing it provides a passive benefit, which it never did before, whereby precision hits grant between 1.5% and 4.5% super energy per kill. So now not only is Golden Gun an absolute nuke for destroying bosses, mini bosses, and even champions in a heartbeat, but it's also regenerated much faster than ever before. With the right class setup, we have easy access to Radiant, which is a global 25% damage buff, and Restoration ×1, which is 35 HP per second of healing. We can extend this through our solar weapon or ability kills thanks to Ember of Empyrean, which means a solar primary weapon in my eyes is the perfect weapon to pair with this build. Sunshot feels absolutely amazing with this build, I won't lie, and is a very viable option. Hand cannons are super strong now in PvE after a series of buffs over the last 6 to 12 months, and Sunshot causing explosions, which further applies Scorch, just blends into any solar setup very well this season. But because we want those precision kills specifically for that super regeneration, often the Sunshot explosions do hinder that process. Bad Juju is also a pairing I've seen suggested, and although its exotic intrinsic ability allows for you to get your super back even faster, I personally didn't enjoy using it with this build. Exotic kinetics just feel weak against any enemies with an elemental shield, and this means Bad Juju won't trigger Ember of Empyrean for the infinite radiant and restoration. No, in my eyes, the perfect weapon for this setup is Vex Mythoclast, and here's why. Vex actually got a massive buff in itself this season, which kind of went under the radar. It got a 10% buff against red bars, a 25% buff against bosses, but most importantly, it got a whopping 200% buff against champions when in the linear fusion rifle mode. Vex was already so powerful against generic trash mobs, its high rate of fire and minimal damage drop-off made it perfect to use as a primary weapon in harder content like GMs, as even with the shields mismatched, it could absolutely tear them down. But this season, it's now even a champion destroyer. In that LFR mode, it absolutely tears them down, making it perfect for both harder and easier content. The fact that it's solar means you trigger Ember of Empyrean, allowing for that constant radiant and restoration, and because it doesn't trigger explosions by itself at base, you don't interfere with the super regeneration as much as Sunshot does. Regardless of what weapon you end up using, the build is super strong for a variety of scenarios. So let's go over the build itself in a bit more detail. For your super, you absolutely want to use Marksman's Golden Gun over Deadshot. The single shot does more damage overall and does the damage a lot quicker. I'm using Gambler's Dodge, Triple Jump, Knife Trick, which not only applies Scorch and grants us Radiant, but this season also applies Weaken effectively to bosses. Healing Grenade, which allows us to apply Restoration ×1 to ourselves, On Your Mark as your first aspect, Knock 'em down is the second aspect I use. Then for my fragments, I use Ember of Singeing. Literally everything scorches this season. Your weapons, your abilities, so you're constantly going to have that 300% increased class ability regeneration with this fragment. Even with a low mobility stat, you're constantly going to have Gambler's Dodge and therefore Knife Trick available. Ember of Empyrean, which allows our weapons and abilities to extend our key buffs. Ember of Solace, which means our key buffs can last for 50% longer. Ember of Combustion, which means final blows with our Golden Gun cause an ignition and they create a fire sprite. Ember of Torches, which means throwing our Knife Trick allows us to become radiant easily. which can then refund our knife through or knock them down instantly. In terms of our armor mods, the two priorities here are to boost our golden gun damage and to generate as many orbs as possible so we boost our super regeneration even more. I run one Solar Strand dual siphon mod, which you can unlock from your artifacts, so both our Vex and our other weapon I'm using generates orbs. Dynamo increases super regeneration whenever we use our dodge near enemies. I run one heavy-handed on my gloves and two impact inductions, so using our knife generates orbs and lowers our healing grenade cooldown. The relevant resistance mods on my chest piece. And then the most important thing is to run two kinetic surge mods, which still works to boost golden gun damage. They fixed this working with 3 kinetic surge mods, but for some reason it still works with 1 or 2 kinetic surge mods, so definitely run those 2 mods. I also run recuperation, which means whenever we pick up an orb of power, it provides us with an instant heal. If you combine that with powerful attraction, anytime you use your dodge, it will hoover up any nearby orbs of power and give you that instant heal through recuperation, similar to Wormask. It's actually super useful in harder content when you can't actually afford to go pick up the orb. Also run Reaper on my cloak so I generate more orbs in general, and then time dilation so our kinetic surges last for as long as possible. In terms of stat priority, the most important stat for the build is 100 resilience. You have that 30% damage reduction. Everything else really is a bonus. A high discipline stat is very useful, so you have your healing grenade up more quickly for those tight situations, and so you can apply restoration more frequently. Then go for mobility, recovery, intellect, and strength in that order. In terms of artifact perks, there are tons of very useful artifact perks this season. Kindling Trigger applies Scorch through our Vex Mythoclast when Radiant. Flint Striker grants us Radiant through rapid precision hits or off rapid final blows. Torch causes enemies affected by Strand or Stasis debuffs to have more damage caused to them when Radiant. So if you use a Scatter Signal with Slice instead of the Overflow I'm using in my Scatter Signal, then you can debuff enemies after using your dodge, which includes bosses, very easily this season, and then through Torch you'll deal more damage to them. Heart of Flame boosts your super damage based on how many nearby allies are near you. Revitalizing Blast applies Weaken through our abilities. Overload rocket launchers means our heavy weapon can now stun weapons as well. Using Apex Predator this season, it's a solar rocket launcher. It has great damage with bait and switch, and reconstruction means you don't need to reload as much. And then through Radiant, we can deal with anti-barrier champions, and through Ignitions, we can stun unstoppable champions as well. In that final column, Solo Operative provides a 15% damage buff when solo, which is very, very nice. And then Rays of Precision, you can still use when using Vex. There's not as many explosions as Sunshot with this, so it doesn't interfere as much with super generation, but you still have that amazing ignition ad clear. So there you have it, my complete Hunter Celestial Nighthawk build. Paired with Vex Mythoclast, it's an absolute powerhouse of a build that can deal with any content this season. Raids, dungeons, lost sectors, or any difficulty of Nightfall, nothing stands a chance against this build. If you enjoyed what I talked about today, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more Destiny build videos, both PvE and PvP. I'm Mr. On It, and that's it for today. Peace out, guys.